Welcome to the program, Colonel Macgregor. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
Well, glad to hear that. I don't know why you mentioned John Bolton, but that's all right.
I mentioned John Bolton. I'm going to, in fact, redo this introduction for our English audience, so you will get to know now why I mentioned John Bolton. About Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Douglas Macgregor is a decorated combat veteran, the former advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration and the author of 5 books. On November 11th, 2020, a Pentagon spokesman announced that Macgregor had been hired to serve as a senior advisor to the new acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, a post he held until Trump left office in January 2021. And I think the mention to Bolton was, in fact, that you were considered for Bolton's position when he left the White House. Once again, welcome, Colonel Macgregor. Now, I want to talk to you about Ukraine. And this is maybe a fun approach that I think I have here. You were a senior advisor to Trump's cabinet, to his defense minister. If you were, and I don't think it will happen, to be invited to the Oval Office today, and President Biden says to you, Doug, we've got an election coming up, not going all that well with the Democrats. I need some good news about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Is there any good news that you can give President Biden, or what would you tell the president?
Well, if he wants good news, he needs to get on the phone, call Moscow and ask for an immediate ceasefire and offer to convene talks, and that we will host and support these talks wherever they are held. We can join them, but we can certainly support them if he would prefer that we not be part of them. But I would go first and foremost to the idea of arranging a ceasefire. I think Americans would like that. Keep in mind that very few Americans are probably interested or even find Ukraine on the map. It's just something foreign, as is most things beyond the borders of the United States. I mean, if you move beyond the borders of the United States, Americans just aren't focused there. They're focused on what's happening at home. And you know that we have an enormous problem with the economy, inflation, widespread criminality in the large cities, open borders, millions of people pouring in that we don't know any of them. We haven't vetted them. So it would be an easy win for him. But I don't see any evidence that he will do that. In fact, the evidence is strongly in favor of confrontation with Russia, which I think is both unnecessary, pointless, and self-defeating.
Let me just go back to the war situation in Ukraine, and we are still in the White House. You're still sitting in the Oval Office. We get a one-sided view not only of why this war, but also what's happening on the battlefield. I don't think we really understand as ordinary citizens anymore what is exactly happening on the battlefield. If President Biden is to ask you, well, do we have Putin in the corner or not? Are we going to win this battle or not? What would you honestly tell me is happening on the battlefield right now, and how do you see things developing from here?
Well, you've raised a very important point. There is a popular narrative that has been developed and systematically disseminated across the West. This narrative says, and has been saying, by the way, since 24 February, that Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. The Russians have lost. The Russians are incompetent. The Russians are stupid. The Russian equipment doesn't work. Tens of thousands of Russians are dying. They're in ruins. Well, this is all nonsense. On the strategic level, I think Europeans and Americans need to understand what the expectation was in Moscow when this began. Remember that for many years now, Mr. Putin and his colleagues have been trying to tell us that there was a limit to their tolerance for what we could do in Eastern Europe. They grudgingly accepted what we'd done in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, but they were very uncomfortable with the notion that they would now move into either White Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine. In 2008 in Budapest, I don't know how anybody could have missed it. Certainly the Germans did not miss it at the time. Mr. Putin made it very clear that there is a red line. You cross into Ukraine and you create a threat to us, we will react. And of course, that's what happened. However, his reaction back in February is very different from what everybody, including me, expected. He gave very strict guidance to his commanders that they were to go in small numbers on a very broad front to avoid killing as many people as possible, avoid infrastructure damage to the extent that they could, because what he was really interested in doing was getting a negotiation going where certain things would happen. Number one, the Ukrainians would accept neutrality and not join NATO. Number two, the two so-called breakaway republics would be recognized in terms of equal rights for Russians who speak Russian and so forth. And for that matter, that's embedded in the Minsk Accords, which were never enforced, that all of the Russians living in eastern Ukraine would have equal rights before the law like the Ukrainians. And then finally, that Ukraine would drop this nonsense about Crimea, recognize Russia's legitimate control of Crimea. Those were the demands. And so things progressed very slowly. And he encountered this extraordinary military resistance that I don't think he expected. I think he thought that the Ukrainian government would be interested in avoiding the conflict, the damage, the destruction. I think he thought that we and the other NATO capitals would be equally interested in avoiding the damage and the destruction. He was wrong. And I think he finally gave up at the end of April when the talks at Istanbul broke down, because at those talks, Mr. Zelensky's representative said, look, we can live with neutrality. We can come, that's something we can live with. We need to discuss the two republics, but, certainly, you have some valid points there. And, we really don't want to talk about Crimea right now, but we can talk about that in the future.
Yep.
Then suddenly the call came in from Washington, presumably, and said, forget it, absolutely out of the question. If you want our support, and we will support you to the bitter end, quote unquote, then you must continue to fight. And at that point, Putin, who had never employed more than 20% of the Russian ground force in eastern Ukraine, finally recognized that the game had changed, so to say. In other words, he was in a very different strategic position from the one that he anticipated. Because initially, his general staff and his military commanders wanted to do things differently. And he refused to do it because he was absolutely convinced that everyone was equally interested in avoiding trouble, avoiding destruction. So he then begins to change direction. This starts in May and June. And his generals come back to him and said, look, if you want to end this war, put it to bed once and for all, we're going to have to go back and do what we wanted to do in February. We need a large-scale Russian military offensive. We need to knock out the power, knock out the fuel supports, knock out the movement of equipment and weapons from the West into Ukraine. We've got to take decisive action, and we're going to need several 100,000 soldiers to do this. We don't want Western Ukraine. That's never been a goal. They never wanted to cross the Dnieper River. But he did decide, yes, Odessa is a Russian-speaking city, always has been. We should retake Odessa. Kharkov was always a Russian-speaking city. We should retake Kharkov. And the southern Ukraine, the Donbass, where they're sitting right now. He finally said, yes, we'll do that. So they went ahead and they did those things, but then they came back and said, look, we still need more troops if we're going to go to Kharkov and Odessa. So then the decision was made to bring in large numbers of these volunteer forces, the Chechens, the Wagner Group, along with large numbers of Russian organizations. You have the Kuban Cossack host, which is now there, which incidentally, they're all descended from Ukrainians that were pushed into the Kuban 300 years ago. They've been fighting in southern Ukraine, about 60, 70,000 of them. And they were playing playing is the wrong word, but conducting a very elastic defense. In other words, defend what you think is worth defending, abandon what isn't. And that brought us to where we are today. And those defenses then were strengthened over time. And the Ukrainians desperately continued to attack. And the Ukrainian army is now bled white, literally. They've had over 100,000 killed, 400,000 wounded. Their hospitals, their aid stations are overflowing with horribly crippled and damaged human beings. And they've begun recruiting at the point of a gun to try and replace the losses. But the initial force of roughly 600,000 which we had trained and equipped for 8 years to fight Russia and ultimately to attack it, that's gone. Those people are either killed or wounded. Some have survived, but the majority haven't. But the Ukrainians have continued to force people into action. And of course, they've been joined by others. Thousands of Poles, Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, mercenaries from various parts of the world. As I understand it, we now have 70 fighters that were part of ISIS who have joined.
I was going to ask that. Yes, I even heard ISIS.
It's bizarre, but this is one of these deals where you take the position, I guess, in Washington that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the bottom line is this thing has gone way beyond anything that anybody anticipated. And the Russians have now stepped back and they are preparing an offensive that will be probably unleashed, I suspect, late November, mid to late November, December. It could come later, but I doubt it. Preferably when the ground is frozen. And at the same time, they continue to strike at the infrastructure. This man, I guess it's Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, he gave a speech yesterday and said that if we wanted to prevent the Ukrainian population from freezing to death, then we'd better send large numbers of generators and blankets because the entire power grid has been destroyed now. Remember, at the beginning of this whole thing, Putin would not do these things. He refused to. He said, no, these are our Slavic brothers. Mm-hmm. They are Orthodox Christian Slavs like us. We don't want to murder them, kill them, destroy them. We want to get along with them. We don't want to govern Ukraine, but we want equal rights for our Russian brothers who are living inside Ukraine. I mean, this is very different from what everybody in the West hears.
Yeah, yeah.
So the bottom line is now we're in the wait mode. Those lines are very stable at the moment where the Russians are located in southern Ukraine. And there are several groups of between 50 and 80,000 Russian troops all around the periphery of Ukraine, all the way to Minsk. Mm-hmm. These forces have gathered and are ready to move at some point when they're told to move. In addition to that, we know that they've moved up all of the operational theater ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything else, all with conventional warheads. We've seen no evidence for any use of any nuclear warhead. The Russians have made it very clear they don't want to use that. And why would anybody want to use a nuclear weapon on their border? Mm-hmm. Would we want to detonate a nuclear weapon just south of Arizona or New Mexico? Absolutely not. Out of the question. So all of this has now happened, and they're prepared for what I think will be a crushing blow. And the Ukrainians, of course, are at their weak point now. They have lost tens of thousands of people. They can't heat themselves. They don't have any mobility. They're running out of fuel. Their tanks and infantry fighting vehicles have been pulled back because there's nothing to fuel those vehicles. This is a terrible set of circumstances. And the question now is, what are we in the West going to do? And there's actually discussion, I'm told, in the White House about sending in some sort of multinational task force on the Iraq model.
Yeah.
Which I would put in the category of lunacy.
Yeah, that was in fact what we heard not too long ago coming from General David Petraeus as well, talking about the so-called, what is it called, the coalition of the willing, something that, of course, we've heard about many times. But
that's a very important statement because it means it's not NATO. Mm-hmm. And let's be blunt, the vast majority of Europeans, whatever they think, are not interested in an all-out war with Russia. I can't see large numbers of Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, French, German troops, and let's face it, that's not very many troops anyway, all suiting up and eagerly marching east for the great war to destroy Russia and Ukraine. It's a lot of nonsense. So this coalition of the willing boils down to essentially the Poles, because the Poles, when it comes to Russia, are certifiable. They're completely irrational. They won't listen to reason, and they're full of hatred, and they have their own agenda in the region. They think that this is an opportunity to restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You know, this is lunacy on stilts. Yeah. And then, of course, you have the Romanians, and they've always wanted to retain or regain control of the territory east of the Danube. What we used to call Bessarabia, now we call this area Moldava. And so now we see that the Romanians may be part of this, but even when you start adding up the numbers and then you add us into it, I don't know, I guess, the British will send something. The British are always there.
Australians.
What?
The Australians probably as well.
Oh, I don't think the Australians are going to make this one. Only if they were extremely stupid.
But let me just ask you this, Colonel Macgregor, that sort of talk does suggest American boots on the ground then. Surely the American public does not want this. Surely they will not support this war. Can Biden, with his powers, I know you have the War Powers Act in the USA, can Biden do this if he wants to without Congress?
I think it would be unwise, but to answer your question, yes. I mean, the way the executive powers are explained in the Constitution, he can justify acting with American military power if he deems it to be an emergency, if he deems it as being in the vital strategic interests of the United States. Now, I wouldn't agree with him, and I think large numbers of people would not. And this is a question of timing. You know, does he do this between now and the 8th of November with the goal of essentially creating a tar baby? In other words, march us into this pit of despair, and then we're stuck. We have to stay there because he did it before the midterms, before he lost control of the House and the Senate. I don't know. There's some people that, you know, are entertaining those ideas. The biggest problem I see with this is the supposition that the Russian military, and we estimate that by the time they finally launch this offensive, they'll have close to 700,000 troops in the theater with thousands of fighting equipment.
And that could potentially grow. I heard you the other day saying that
yes.
could, in fact, grow up to 1 million men in the theater.
Yes. I think you could see that grow in January to 1 million. The bottom line is there's an underlying assumption that's false. That is, if we Americans fly the flag and say we're the coalition of the willing and we're coming to make peace, that no one will shoot at us. Wrong. The Russian people, we're not talking about Mr. Putin now or his immediate government. We're talking about the Russian nation is enraged. People in the West don't understand this. They are enraged. First of all, they've been unhappy in one aspect with Mr. Putin, not with his general position and his views and his attitudes and so forth, but with his failure to do what he wants to do now back in February. So the Russians are saying, look, we are not going to put up with this nonsense anymore. NATO cannot put missiles and troops on our borders and threaten us. And if we have to crush Ukraine once and for all, then we are going to do it.
I want to just let me interrupt you here, if you don't mind. Yeah. I want to talk about specifically the motive for this war. I have great difficulties wrapping my logical brain around this. The question keeps up popping in my head, what's in it for the Americans? But the other question is, you are led by some brilliant men and women in the Pentagon, I assume so, in the White House, in your government.
Well, that's a very false assumption.
Well, let's assume there is at least some knowledge there. What I don't get is the question. Putin has been saying the same thing for the past 20 years.
Yes.
We've heard about things like the Monroe Doctrine. We know about the failures of implementing the Minsk Agreement. We know about what happened when the Russians tried to place missiles in Cuba back in the 60s. There seems to be something very reasonable, and I don't want to sound like a Putin puppet because that's what I'm being accused of when I ask these questions.
Yeah,
seems to me there's something reasonable in the demands of Vladimir Putin to say, this is where we draw the red line. We don't want to have your weapons literally a few kilometers away from our borders. What is it that the Americans do not understand? Or is this just hard-headedness? Or what is in it for the Americans?
Well, on one level, Friedrich Nietzsche said that victory in war, that makes the victor stupid. In other words, victory makes the man who wins stupid. And we are very stupid because for the last, I would argue, certainly 30, 40 years, we have been dealing with extremely weak opponents, areas of the world that can hardly be called serious nation states, artificial constructs created in the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty in 1918.
Yeah, but you didn't do too well in those wars either.
Well, I agree with you 100%, but unfortunately, That's not the perception here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even the perception among the American people. They don't realize that in addition to having been a political debacle, these were also strategic military failures. And a lot of that failure is owned by the general officers that commanded. Now, someone like Petraeus, who's never been in combat, he's never been under fire, he's never killed anybody in action. And that's true for most of these general officers, frankly. His only experience of warfare is fighting very weak insurgents, to the point where he would review operations in PowerPoint slides and then give permission for someone to do something 30, 40, 50, 100 miles from his location and then go have lunch. In other words, what we've been through over the last 30, 40 years is far, far closer to what the British and the French experienced when they were the colonial masters of much of the world, especially the British. Now, you take this mentality that assumes a degree of supremacy in all capabilities, and you put us in the situation we are in now, and you add to this utterly ridiculous notion that the Russians are incompetent, stupid, and so forth, that none of their equipment works and they don't know what they're doing, when that is absolutely, absolutely not true. And you reach this point where people, senior leaders in the military, are saying, well, we could do that. We could go into Western Ukraine, a place the size of Texas, and we'll have maybe 50, 60,000 troops, and we can make peace there, or we can draw red lines, and the Russians will have to accept it. Unfortunately, that's not evidence for brilliance. That's evidence for stupidity, for failing to know what you're going to deal with. It's very reminiscent of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. It was manned and commanded by, 150,000 troops, commanded by officers whose entire experience of warfare was the empire. Suddenly, they faced the Imperial German Army. And almost everyone in that 150,000-man British Expeditionary Force was killed or wounded in 6 weeks. The rest is history. We are somewhat in that position. Now, that's the first thing. Secondly, politically, there are people in Washington who see Russia as one of those critical obstacles to domination of the world by U.S. finance and financial interests. Remember, the world of finance revolves around New York City and London. The Russians have made it very clear that they are not going to be subjugated to this system the way so much of the world is. And there are lots of people that happen to agree with Mr. Putin because, remember, we have been able to borrow trillions of dollars and pass our debt on to others because of dollar dominance, dollar-based exchanges. That's the other aspect of this thing. Now, we say publicly, of course, as we always do, that Mr. Putin is evil, the government is evil, the society is evil, corrupt, criminal, because we do that whenever we go to war with anybody. We immediately say, well, we're dealing with Stalin or Hitler or some version of it. That, of course, is not true. Our society is hardly perfect. Theirs is not perfect. There are very few perfect societies of which I am aware, but the notion that we should go to war to change those societies, which is what we've been doing for 30 years, is sheer lunacy. It's always failed. It's not going to succeed in Eastern Europe. And now we are faced with a great power, a serious great power that is not going to roll over for us. So I really need to correct that false assumption of brilliance. I wrote an op-ed that, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It talks about the war option in Ukraine. And specifically, I go to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's description of the leading strategist in the Imperial Russian Army in 1914. And the man was a blockhead. He was a fool. He had no more understanding of what real war was about than Petraeus does. That's our problem.
Well, you sketch a very scary world to us because it is still American dominance, and we are all subject to what happens in Washington. I see we're running out of time here. I was going to tell you just something, just to give an idea of where I come from in terms of my worldview. I grew up in a small town in the mountains of a little province called Mpumalanga in South Africa. And, you know, we were thousands of miles, kilometers away from America. But from the day I was born, we were almost taught to love America. I grew up with Elvis Presley. I grew up with Hollywood. I grew up with, we cried when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. We jubilated with you when Armstrong stepped on the moon. That seems to me that goodwill to America seems to be really fast disappearing in the last couple of years of my life. I want to mention something that I picked up this morning. According to the 2017 Pew survey, close to 40% of the respondents across 38 countries in the world consider the United States' influence and power as the major threat to peace in the world. Try to make me understand, what is it that you can gain from what you call containment?
Well, it's not really containment. You're talking about a history of interventions in other people's societies that resulted in the destruction
250 in the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. George Washington, when he was president, said, "Give us 20 years of peace, and we will be the strongest nation on earth." And he argued vociferously against alliances and for essentially for perpetual American neutrality. I grew up in a family that believed in that. My grandfather was in the First World War. He came back on my mother's side, and he came back from the First World War convinced that we'd fought the wrong people. We had been brought in to rescue banks and bankers in France, Britain, and the United States. And he said it was a catastrophe. So when the Vietnam War was on in 1966, 67, 68, I listened to arguments in my family where my grandfather would say, "Well, if you want to support the troops, bring them home. What are we doing in Vietnam?" Well, we haven't been cured of this ailment because for too many years, too many Americans see war as something that happens on someone else's turf. It's not something that happens here. Mm-hmm. And when bombs fall and explosions occur, they tend to stand up and cheer and say, "See, we're powerful, we're great."
Yeah.
You try to get people to understand that our greatness as a nation is not served by destroying others. But unfortunately, there's a large portion of the population that's confused on that point. And once again, here, nobody today remembers the Second War or the First World War. Don't remember the slaughter, the losses, the casualties. Those people are gone. I do, because I had family that fought in those wars. I remember those vividly because give you another example. My maternal grandfather fought in World War I, sat with me and told me about the discussion he had with his great uncle in 1905 about the Battle of Gettysburg and how terrible that was.
Yeah.
So I have a relationship with the past that most Americans do not.
Yeah.
So I see this as complete lunacy. By the way, just for advertisement purposes, I grew up in North Philadelphia with Ukrainians and Poles. Mm-hmm. They were wonderful people. I loved them.
Yeah.
And they hated each other. And they never missed an opportunity to beat the living daylights out of each other. Eastern Europe is a place that suffers acutely from permanent tribalism. All of the people that live there as individuals are wonderful, but they all hate each other. We in the United States don't understand any of it, and we need to stay out of it. And we shouldn't be involved in this at all. What we should be doing is hosting peace talks, working instead of wasting all this money on military equipment for the Ukrainians. We should be using that money to build peace, to repair this place, to help it. But we're not doing that.
Am I right if I say, Colonel Macgregor, that this is also really in your hands at the moment? That if Washington wants to, if there's goodwill to sit around the table and to listen to both sides, that there is a huge space there for us to agree on certainly finding peace in that region, that it's not that illogical. In other words, what I'm trying to say to you, that Washington is in fact at the moment standing in the way of peace, blocking peace we can attain that peace tomorrow if we have a different view from Washington.
Sadly, I think you're right. Mm-hmm. It pains me to say this, but I never thought I would live to see a president of the United States who would not immediately involve himself to prevent a war with Russia under any and all circumstances. We were always very sensitive to that. Every president was. For some reason, this man and his supporters in Washington, D.C. isn't, and I think some of the reasons I've tried to explain to you and your listeners.
Well, let me say to you that I really am saddened by it all, because as I told you, my little Elvis Presley story, I've been to the States a number of times. I have never been so overwhelmed by genuinely lovely, kind, decent people. And what I hear and see coming from Washington is so far from my on-the-ground experience with American people. We've got little time left. I just want to quickly ask you about the Nord Stream pipeline, because it's kind of gone silence on it. And I saw a report this morning that the Russians are now saying that they have evidence, or some evidence, that points the finger to Britain. If that is the case, if there's any value in that, then we certainly also know that that action could not have happened without the consent of Washington. Simple question. In your view, who did that? I think personally that it is to me very close to just a simple international act of state terrorism, not even sabotage.
Well, I would go a step further and say that if you're a Russian and you look at this, it was an act of war.
It is.
If I were a German sitting in Berlin, I would regard this as an act of war directed against the German people.
Yeah.
To be perfectly blunt, I do not know who did it because I don't have access to that information, and I have not seen any concrete evidence. But clearly, let's rule out two people. Let's rule out Berlin and let's rule out Moscow.
Yeah.
The notion that the Russians did this is absurd. But then you have to step back from this event and say, well, if this is really an act of war, and I think it is, this man Putin has certainly exercised a great deal more restraint than he gets credit for. And we haven't even begun to discuss these false flags, the terrible slander directed at Russia for war crimes that Russian troops have not committed.
Yeah.
And no one bothers to talk about these Azov Nazis and the terrible things that they've done to their own people, not just to the Russians. And that's continues at this point. So I agree with you, and I'm hoping that someone will sober up, but I don't see any evidence for it at the moment. And unfortunately, I'm judged a Putin agent, even though I spent my 33 years in uniform trying to defend Western civilization from communism. So
I'm gonna close this, Colonel Macgregor, with just two very quick questions. One question: if we are to see the horrors of a nuclear attack, I know it sounds very almost corny to ask the question, but who would push the button first? Is there any indication? Have you got anything that you can point to that will say that Putin is hell-bent on slamming that button?
No, there's no evidence for a Russian interest in that whatsoever, as we discussed at the beginning. And their doctrine is entirely retaliatory. Unless someone uses such a weapon against them, they will not. And we now have precision. And the nuclear weapon was attractive in the 50s and the 60s because we did not have precision. So we were wasting lots of ammunition trying to destroy a target. Well, if you use a nuclear weapon and you miss, you're still going to get the target in some fashion. We don't need it anymore. It has no military utility. Here in the United States, there are foolish and stupid people that talk about a limited nuclear war. But I don't believe that they are in the White House. I don't believe that they are at the top of the Pentagon. So my view is there will be no nuclear exchange, and I wish everyone would stop talking about the damn thing.
Colonel Macgregor, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Let me end this program segment by reiterating what I said before, and what I think you confirmed is that there is a way to end this war, and that would be for President Biden to pick up that telephone. Thank you very much indeed.